In this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast. Nature of exercise is that you create more metabolites than you do at rest. These metabolites have the ability to then get sensed by your brain. Your brain says, oh shit, we're under a stress now, and releases stress hormones. They're called catecholamines, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, shuts down insulin secretion, really changes the hormonal milieu within your blood. And then that is going to lead to changes in your cardiovascular system. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today I'm joined by Dave Schell, founder and coach of Kaizen Endurance, for another episode of Fast Physiology, where we do a succinct dive into a single endurance topic. In today's episode, we're going to explore the question, what's the point of a warm-up and how to do a warm-up correctly? Enjoy. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Dr. Phil, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so another episode of Fast Physiology, and today Dave and I really want to talk about a warm-up, because I think this is something that is greatly underestimated in terms of its utility and its use within actual training. And I think a lot of people just miss the bar on warm-ups a lot of the time. So Dave, if you wouldn't mind, in your coaching practice, how do you use a warm-up? What's your criteria for getting an athlete warmed up? And, just kind of give me like your protocol. What do you tell somebody is like how to warm up?
Yeah, first off, I want to throw some shade, because this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode. Is it makes me crazy when there's a platform like Zwift or Trainer Road or something, and it has you're going to do some really hard intervals, and it has this like 10-minute ramp warm up. And if you've ever tried one of those, it's like you do it and you do your first interval and you're like, it just does not feel great. You're not ready for it, And so point being, I think like one thing that makes me crazy is that there isn't one uniform warm up that's universal and just works for everybody. So for me, for my athletes, first off, it really depends on the work we're doing. And so if it's going to be an endurance ride, it's going to look different than if we're going to jump into intervals. Mm-hmm. For an endurance ride, I'll say, 15 to 30 minutes warm up or whatever, like however long it takes you. If they're short on time, and let's say they've only got 60 or 90 minutes to ride and we're going to do intervals, then I'll insert some work in that. And so it might be like 10 minutes ride easy, 5 minutes at like a zone 3 kind of tempo pace, a couple of short, like 30 to 60 second efforts just to like get the legs going, and then into the intervals. And I think, and you'll probably speak to this too, for me, this really came full circle or like really shone a light on it when I started using the Moxy, and I could actually see in real time that the muscle oxygenation coincided with my RPE and with my heart rate coming down and stuff like that. And so just really emphasize the importance of a good warm up, especially if you're going to do harder intervals.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think the least a warm up should do is get you warm and prepared for your work. But right. it can be so much more than that, right? It can allow you to go into your first interval and actually be able to handle that first interval. So now you're doing even more quality work within your interval, workout, or even within your zone 2 workout. It can kind of the opposite effect if you do a horrible warm up. And this is something that I always encourage any Moxy user to actually like look into, is like, do your normal warm up and tell me how high your SMO2 gets. And most of the time they report back, especially like, traditional cyclist runners. They're like, yeah, my SMO2 started at about 50 or 60 when I first started my run on my bike. It went down to 30 and it stayed there the entire time during my workout. And you're like, okay, well, you're obviously going into some level of oxygen debt and not letting that recover. And so on the flip side of things, what a proper warm up actually looks like from an internal measuring perspective is, yes, SMO2 is always going to come down because your body needs to use that oxygen immediately upon contraction, and it just takes time for your cardiovascular system to ramp up, your blood vessels to vasodilate, other things like that. So it'll come down. But what a good warm up looks like is that SMO2 comes down and then it starts to trickle up. And that's kind of the point of that easy riding in the beginning, is to deliver more oxygen than your muscle needs so that you get a net positive increase in SMO2. And then here's something crazy that I do tell people during the warm up is I say, if you're on a trainer or if you're running, just completely stop. Your
Mm.
heart rate should be a little elevated. And what you should see is that SMO2 kick up just a little bit more. Wait till it gets to a high, and then do something like you were saying, like 3 minutes close to tempo, or accelerations, or something along those lines. And what you'll see is that your muscle oxygenation gradually, it'll go down and then it'll come up, and then it'll go down and then it'll come up, and it'll widen each time. So when I do a warm up, as opposed to some of the people who I think are inappropriately doing a warm up where their SMO2 goes from 60 to 30 and stays at 30, mine goes from 60 to 40, trickles up to 55 or 60. I rest, it goes up to maybe 65. And then I do these accelerations, and each time it's like goes down to 20% and then up to 70%, down to 20%, up to 75%, down to 20 or 18%, up to 75%. And that's when I know I'm actually warmed up, is when I'm reaching that maximal saturation. And I'm not saying that that's like the perfect way to do a warm up, but I think it's better than just being like, okay, I'm on Zwift and I'm going to do a ramp and then I'm ready to go. And then I suffer through my first interval, and then it's, kind of almost all downhill from there. But yeah, that's my approach to warming up. And I think the only way you're actually going to be able to know if you're properly warming up is if you actually measure something that is going to be reflective of what's actually internally going on. Because the whole point of a warm up is to actually warm your body up and get it prepared for the work that you're about to do.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you is like physiologically, like what is happening when you warm up? Like
Yeah.
what do your muscles look like in a rested state? And then what do they look like once you've actually warmed up and start to do work?
Yeah. So I mean, the point of a warm up is to prepare your body physiologically for whatever work is about to come. And when you're at rest, generally speaking, there's less blood flow to the muscles because you're at rest. You're not diverting blood to the muscles. Most of the blood is probably digestive tract, other things like that, to your brain, to important organs. But when then you start exercising, your muscle, like I said, is going to demand a lot of oxygen. And in that demand for oxygen, it's going to be creating a lot of metabolites. So I'm not saying like, oh, you're going to fatigue or anything like that. It's just the nature of exercise is that you create more metabolites than you do at rest. These metabolites have the ability to then get sensed by your brain. Your brain says, oh shit, we're under a stress now, and releases stress hormones. They're
Mm.
called catecholamines, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, shuts down insulin secretion, really changes the hormonal milieu within your blood. And then that is going to lead to changes in your cardiovascular system. So if you ever notice when you start exercising, your heart starts to beat harder and faster. That one of the reasons for that is because of the release of these hormones. And the reason why it's beating harder and faster is particularly because of that drive or the necessity for more oxygen at the muscle. So your heart is trying to catch up with its ability to actually deliver enough oxygen to the muscle. So by measuring muscle oxygenation with NIRS, you actually get an idea of how well your heart is matching oxygen delivery to the muscle, depending on, how hard it's working. So again, like I think using Moxie is a perfect example of this, because you can say, okay, at the very beginning, my muscle is going to be demanding a lot of oxygen. So oxygen's going to go down. My cardiovascular system hasn't ramped up fast enough yet in order to be able to deliver enough oxygen. Then as you start to see that inflection point, that increase, that means that your heart is now finally catching up or over delivering oxygen compared to the muscle. And that requires your heart to uh, beat more blood, your lungs to actually be able to transfer that oxygen onto the blood, and your capillary beds have to be activated in order to get more blood to the muscle. So there's all these things that actually have to happen. And another thing that actually happens is your muscles do get warm. So
Right.
we call it a
And
warm up.
tissues, right?
Yeah, your tissues get warm. So your tissues get warm and there's a slight acidification. And both of these allow for a shift in the oxygen dissociation curve where oxygen can more readily be offloaded
Mm,
at the muscle. Um, we also, there's an optimal range for enzymatic activity in terms of pH and heat. So we're actually moving more towards that optimal range for pH and heat as well. So a warm up is really getting your body physiologically primed then to handle the bigger stresses that are coming.
yeah. And I want to say that it also prepares you mentally. I always,
Mm-hmm.
in my coaching, I call it the theory of relativity, in that, like, if you haven't done a hard effort, then whatever you can, like, if whatever you do above baseline is going to feel hard. But if you do some harder efforts above that,
Mm-hmm.
then when you come back down a little bit below, it's going to feel relatively easier than if you just went from easy to hard. Right. And so,
Yeah.
just to backtrack a little bit, when you were talking about breathing and your heart rate elevating, breathing elevating and stuff, I think anecdotally I used to notice this a lot with running. Like the first mile of a run always felt horrible
Mm-hmm.
because like you're kind of out of breath and everything, and like nothing's warmed up. But then all of a sudden, as you go on, heart rate comes down, it starts to feel a little bit more comfortable as you warm up and stuff like that. And I would say same thing in cycling. If I'm not using a moxie, like just on the trainer, like my RPE might start a little bit higher. As I get more warmed up, RPE comes down, my heart rate comes down, power goes up a little bit. And so again, just more evidence that like your body is more prepared to do that work.
Yeah, I also think though that people have a tendency to overdo their warm up because they think that by winning the warm up they're going to win the workout. And this is something I've seen in, CrossFit gyms.
Yeah.
I've seen in cross country practices at the high school, the junior college, and the college level, is that typically the people who do their warm ups the hardest, unless they're like, abnormally fit compared to everybody else, are typically not the ones that then go in and do really well in the workout or win the race or,
Right.
whatever it is. And I caution people on that because when I say when I start my warm-ups, some days because my legs are heavy, I start at like 60 or 80 watts because I'm just like feel like crap. I'm like,
Right.
okay, I'm just gonna start slowly pedaling and then I ramp it up, right? But I start low and then I just slowly ramp it up over time. And I think it's better to do that, to start too low than it is too high. And again, because of the disparity in oxygen delivery and oxygen utilization. The harder you start, the more oxygen utilization you're going to have, and the more oxygen, the more difference you're going to have between oxygen delivery and oxygen demand. So essentially, from that perspective, if you think about finite resources of your non-aerobic systems, you're almost depleting your non-aerobic systems before even getting your aerobic system up and running. So you're really, kind of depleting yourself before even getting into the workout. And this is another thing, is when I say accelerations, like I go pretty hard, but because I've done this over time, my accelerations start at like uh you know th- 300 watts until SMO2 comes down, and then I let it go. And then it's like 350, and then 400, and then 450, and then 500 for like 30 seconds or so. So sometimes I get up to even like close to 600. And I think I went a little bit overboard on the 600 one, but like you can get up to 500, 550, and then still be effective in your workout because you're replenishing your energy stores from oxygen later on in the warm up, as opposed to depleting them in the beginning of the warm up by just going out too hard.
Yeah, so I want to put you on the spot here, and I'm guessing you're familiar with this, but I feel like it's kind of old. This idea of a priming warm up, and I can't
Hmm.
remember exactly off the top of my head, but there was a study, gosh, quite a while ago, where people would warm up for 10 to 20 minutes at like an endurance pace, and then they'd do like 6 minutes at like best effort. So
Hmm.
6 minutes best effort, and then like 10 to 20 minutes easy before a race, and then they do a time trial. And if I recall the paper correctly, like the people that did the priming warm up did better in the time trial. So I guess what is the current thinking on that, and what are the mechanisms behind that that makes it work if it is effective?
Yeah, yeah, you really did put me on the spot, but I think I am not familiar with that paper, but what I can say is that Olav Alexander Boo just talked about this on the Peter Attia podcast, and what he was saying is that yeah, your first VO2 max effort, for example, is going to be done at a certain VO2 and a certain power output, but then if you rest long enough and you come back and you do a second one, you're actually somehow able to go higher in power and have a higher VO2 max. So there's something happening in terms of that priming
Yeah.
session that is actually allowing for your body the second time around to be to more effectively uptake, transport, and utilize oxygen. And it's probably got stuff to do with the like truly warming up the cells, like getting them warm, because max level effort for 6 minutes gets you pretty warm.
Right.
um it's probably leaving some level of like holdover of like vasodilation, so it's easier for your cardiovascular system to ramp back up following that hard interval.
Yeah.
um I think there is something physiologically that is going on that is actually allowing you to then better handle the second stress that is going to occur. Obviously, as long as you give adequate rest in between, whether that's 10 to 20 minutes or maybe even a little bit more. And you do have to, I think you still have to be a little careful, like not to burn all of your matches in that time period. But this idea, this notion that like, oh, if you do anything hard, before, say, like for example, the warm up I do is the same warm up no matter if I'm doing a zone 2 workout or an interval workout, minus I might do a couple punch like more challenging intervals going into an interval workout, but I always do the repeat desaturations going into like the 2 hours of zone 2 work that I'm going to do. I think that there is a big misconception that you're going to destroy your gains by doing anything above zone 2 in a warm up, because in the warm up, you shouldn't be going so hard that you're accumulating, so much metabolic acidosis and have lactate, be circulating in your blood that it just hinders everything. So you need to temper it from that perspective. But I also think that from a priming perspective, your your body is just going to be much more capable of handling the like all of the physiological processes if you have a little bit extra metabolic acidosis going on, if you are a little bit warmer, all of these sort of things. So that's my philosophy on it, and I know a lot of people don't agree with that or don't subscribe to that.
Yeah. I just want to go back to something you said too about seeing in the intervals that you're able to do more work. And again, I would come back to this. Yeah, I know there's a physiological component to it, but I also think there's a psychological component to it where you're just more able to handle the stress of that work because your body, like
Mm-hmm.
you've been introduced to it. And so the second one's not as much of a shock to the system.
Yeah.
Going back to the priming thing, I think it's interesting that because I've tried using it with athletes in the past, and I think it can definitely get in their heads where it like doing a 6 minute all out effort before you're about to do a 30 to 60 minute time trial can kind of screw with you a little bit. Like
Yeah.
even if your muscles are fine and you've got plenty of energy and glycogen and everything else, like it just gets to you, right? Like you just
Mm-hmm.
did this really hard effort so now to like get yourself ready to do another hard effort might be
Yeah.
a bit of a stretch. And so I did stop using it after a while.
I mean, I think that's like the beauty of it, right? Is play around with what works for people, because some people might be prepared to go to the start line just after 5 minutes fairly easy, 5 minutes medium, 5 minutes slightly harder than medium, right? Other people like myself, right? I love the repeated desaturation using the Moxie, because it primes my muscles to have the most amount of oxygen just hanging around there. And I have found that going into follow-up workouts, that really helps me. Other
Yeah.
people might benefit from like 3 minutes close to race pace. So it doesn't have to be the 6 minutes, right? Because let's be honest, 6 minutes is a lot.
Yeah.
So I think that's the cool thing. And I think like being flexible with how your warm up is and individualizing it is going to be really key to actually coming up with a good warm up for yourself. But you have to be willing to kind of play around with it. And the last thing I will say is that if you design a warm up for yourself and you do something consistently over time, you actually get better at getting warmed up faster. So it used to take me 5, 6, 7 accelerations in order to get warmed up. And now typically I'm warmed up like after 10 minutes of riding and then 3 accelerations.
Yeah. And I think what I would add to that, or what I hear in that, is ultimately it's about finding something that works for you, something that's repeatable, that helps you feel ready to either do the workout or do the race or whatever. And so I think just to save on mental bandwidth, having that routine is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't have to be optimal in all senses of the word, but it's like whatever's optimal for you and is going to help you feel ready to give it your all in that workout or
Yes.
the race.
Yeah, exactly. I'll leave everybody with this. I've said this on the podcast before. It's not my original thing, but what is practical becomes optimal. So make a workout or make a warm up, excuse me, that is practical for you, that gets you mentally prepared, that makes you feel physiologically prepared. And most likely that is what is going to be optimal leading into race day. Dave, do you have anything you want to leave them with?
I think the last thing I'll say is what I started with is there is no universal duration that a warm up has to be. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really whatever helps you feel warmed up and ready to perform.
Yep. Totally agree with that. So if you guys aren't familiar with this, this is another episode of Fast Physiology where we take a deep dive on one topic. We jump back and forth between my podcast, Critical O2, and Dave's podcast, Training Babble. So if you haven't seen the other episodes, go over to Dave's Training Babble podcast and listen to those. We're always just going back and forth, and these are super fun because him and I do have fun opinions on these topics, and it's just always fun to talk about them. So let us know what sort of topics you want us to cover. We'd love to get your opinion and do our best to cover these things in a very succinct manner. So you can always catch me on Instagram at Critical02. You can catch Dave at Kaizen Endurance. On Instagram, you can comment down below if you're on YouTube, and you can leave us a 5-star review if you're on Spotify. That would greatly help us. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
Take